Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Virtual NetKAL Forum. Now, if you all tried to join us earlier when we were going live, we had some technical difficulties and we were trying to resolve those and troubleshoot, but unfortunately, we were not able to do so. So we decided to take this route of recording this session and the entire event via Zoom, and here we are. So I'm going to do the introductions again, starting with myself. My name is Mei Lee. I am the host and executive producer of The Mei Lee Show, which is a podcast in both audio and video form. And it's a show that focuses on Asians and Asian American issues, people, topics. That show started in early February, long before COVID hit, so things have changed quite a bit. I'm also the founder of Lotus Media House, and I have been a broadcast journalist for over 30 years, having been an anchor for CNN, CNBC, ABC, among others, as well as having worked for Oprah Winfrey's first TV network, Oxygen Media, that she launched back in 2000. Now, this forum is co-organized by NetKAL Inc. and Global Korean Leaders Foundation USA. Now, NetKAL is an organization of Korean American leaders, and what their purpose is to try to empower and shape and grow civic-minded leaders from the Korean American community as well as around the world. And the Global Korean Leaders Foundation USA is a partner institution of NetKAL. And this forum is sponsored by the Korea Foundation, an organization affiliated with Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we'd like to thank the Korea Foundation for its sponsorship. Now, the theme of this virtual forum is unlocking ethnic minorities' power and influence in mainstream America. Right now, you can't argue that we are going through an unprecedented time in this country and the world. There is so much upheaval. There are so many challenges. There's so much division, and there's culture wars taking place, and there's a lot of violence and ill will. So all the more reason to have a forum like this, where we can empower different communities and, of course, empower the Korean and Korean American community to find our voice. We want to inspire and incite positive change. We want to focus on solutions to division and misunderstanding. We want to elevate the Korean image and take control of the narrative, because oftentimes the narrative is controlled by outsiders, others, who oftentimes can misrepresent, misinterpret, for instance, in the media, in politics, and other public forums. So this event is all about raising awareness, it's about educating, it's about informing, and it's about learning from other communities. That's why this first panel is so important, because we have gathered together three wonderful speakers who come from different backgrounds, who can share their experiences and give us some ideas of best practices to help the world become a better place, because boy, do we need it right now. So let me do some quick introductions. First is John Chiang. He is former California State Treasurer. He held that role from 2015 to 2019. He serves as member of the board of directors of Apollo Medical Holdings, Inc., Aegis Systems, and Zeus Technologies. He also serves on advisory boards of Pasadena Private Finance and Calyx Peak. And John is a first-generation Taiwanese American. Next, we have Richard Hirschhaut. He is director of the American Jewish Committee of Los Angeles. Now, the AJC was established in 1906. It is one of the oldest Jewish advocacy organizations, and according to the New York Times, it is, quote, widely regarded as the dean of American Jewish organizations. Richard has worked to advance human rights, democratic values, and promote security and well-being of Jews in the US, Israel, and around the world. And finally, we have Reverend William D. Smart Jr. He is president and CEO of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He is also co-pastor of the Christ Liberation Ministries in Los Angeles. Reverend Smart served as an advocate and disciple of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. throughout his life. He has worked with various social justice movements and has been a faith-based coordinator for political campaigns, including presidential elections in 2000, 2004, and 2016. Welcome to all of you, and I want to give huge thanks to all of you for being so patient and being willing to stick around to hold this panel, because I think it's so important. So thank you so much. It's so good to see you clearly and hear you as well. So let's cut to the chase. This is what I wanted to ask you before we had our technical difficulties, but we're seeing, as I said, we're seeing such tremendous upheaval right now, such division and such violence and such, such uncertainty and anxiety. We're all going through this right now. So it is, something that nobody can really escape. But what's frightening is what's happening. It's this growing chasm between communities and cultures and races and, obviously political ideology. So I would like to ask each one of you, because you all come from different backgrounds, what do you think about what's going on, and what are some of your observations? So John, if I could start with you.
Well, first, my first impression is I just want to thank NetKAL for uniting all of us to have this healthy, vibrant, and especially timely conversation. You pointed out, May, so appropriately, the extraordinary divisions, the divisiveness, right? The only way you remedy that is, as we've heard, we shall overcome. You bring people of goodwill who are responsible, who are serious, who care about each other, and make that the prevalent and dominating view, right? Push away the hatred. America has long had that battle. The world has long had that battle. We live in the wealthiest country in this world. We have the resources if we have the determination and the will. I just thought of a recent giant that passed away, John Lewis. John Lewis just inspired generations of Americans, including me. I have a photo with him at Reagan National Airport from a couple years ago. But here's a man who brought incredible humility and dignity, despite the fact that he was beaten, almost lost his life. If he can have that courage, we can come together, write his story, so many other stories, to make sure that America and the world prevails, that good overcomes evil.
Well, John Lewis is a true hero in anyone's eyes. If we could even be half the man he was during his lifetime, this world would be such a better place, wouldn't it? So may he rest in peace, but may his legacy live on forever, because he was a giant. He was a giant when it came to, peaceful, wanting to incite peaceful change. So thank you for bringing him up. I was actually going to bring him up later, but great to honor him right off the top. Richard, let me turn to you. Share your thoughts of what's going on and your observations, and from the Jewish American community. I mean, there's a rise in anti-Semitism as well right now, so that's not great news.
That's right, and let me again also add my gratitude to our friends, our partners with NetKAL for including us and for seeing this program through. This has been in the works for many, many months. So if we had to wait another hour or so to go on air, it's certainly well worth it. And I also want to express my thoughts about the passing of John Lewis as well. I had the great privilege of knowing him, having met him on several occasions, and having worked with him in my previous role with both the Anti-Defamation League and the Illinois Holocaust Museum to hold up his life lesson and his having gotten into good trouble in his life as an example of the kind of activism and the kind of spirit and courage that we all need to muster at this particular moment. I'm very concerned about the well-being of our country. I'm very concerned because we've seen, certainly through the COVID-19 crisis, the terrible price that so many have paid. And we've also seen, and I think have come to understand, the tremendous power of words. Words can inspire, words can heal, but words can also sow division. And words, regrettably, that have been repeated again and again from the corridors of power, from the ultimate bully pulpit in our country, have in fact sown division. And that has an impact. That does lead to episodes of bias. That does lead to hate crime. And from where we sit at the American Jewish Committee, AJC, it is simply unacceptable. And when we see it, we have to challenge it. We have to speak out. But I am balancing my sense of anxiety with also a tremendous sense of hope and optimism when we saw tens of thousands of people on a daily basis take to the streets to demand racial justice and social justice. This is indeed more than a moment. It is a re-energized movement, I believe, and it is upon us not to squander it in any way.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. Obviously, you were referring to the Black Lives Matter movement that really galvanized people from all different walks of life. All different communities came together to show that kind of support. So Reverend Smart, coming from your background, a man of faith, but also having worked in social justice for decades, even with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., what does this moment feel like for you in terms of what's going on in this country?
First of all, let me thank you and the network of Korean American leaders for having me here also with these fine gentlemen. And I think this is a pivotal point in America right now. And coming from my perspective, I think we have to realize what's really going on, that there's really a reckoning. I think George Floyd's death was I told people for the last 3 months now that it was more than the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the drop of coffee that overtipped the coffee cup. It was the rainfall that burst open the dam. And so we're just at that place where people has said more than enough is enough. They said, what are we going to do about? We're sick and tired of white supremacy, sick and tired of police brutality, sick and tired of everything that has been the vestiges of supremacy. And so you see people, not just people of color, you just see Americans tearing down monuments that represented something. You see people demanding and changing the names of Native Americans that have been so denigrating to the American population. And so it's just that moment, May, and we have to really understand the moment. And I'm glad that Rick said it. He said it's not a moment, it's a movement. And a movement whose time has come, and it's affecting all type of things that that America has needed to change since 400 years ago, when Africans were brought here and the way we've been treated until now, and how that affects everybody, how it affects racism, how it affects anti-Semitism, how it affects the way we've treated women, all of that. It's a new movement. Yeah. And spurred on by a death, and life is coming out of his death. One thing I want to say is, as we move forward, I did not know Martin Luther King physically, but I had spent time with all of his lieutenants. John Lewis, who became a disciple of his, C.T. Vivian, who recently died. He assigned me to the chapter I'm in now, in a way, and Joseph Lowry, who I knew when I was a student in Birmingham, Alabama. So it's just a time for us to really respect, love each other, and work for each other's wholeness.
Well, I appreciate all of you commenting on what your observations are now, and I can't help but think, as a journalist, we have to observe all of these things with a critical eye, obviously. And it just seems like everything is happening at the same time, right? So we have this health pandemic that is obviously affecting everyone. We have social upheaval. We have economic issues, fallout, and we have, this civic unrest. So how do you even get your head around how you solve these issues when everything seems to be happening at the same time? I've been saying on my show, this is like the ultimate perfect storm because everything is happening at the same time. So even as advocates of, social movements or, community leadership, do you feel overwhelmed? And so I think the average person would ask, what could I even possibly do to help the situation when everything is happening at the same time? Richard, if I can have you answer that first.
Sure. Before the horrific murder of George Floyd, and as we began to believe, ultimately incorrectly, that we were perhaps going to emerge from the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic and begin to forge and embrace a new reality. Because COVID-19 laid bare so plainly societal inequities in access to quality health care, education, economic opportunity, it really called into question what kind of society are we going to be? What kind of society can we become and must we become when we embrace and begin to come into this new normal? Then, of course, we had the tragic, horrific murder of George Floyd and others that preceded and followed. That layered onto it and really just lifted and to Pastor Smart's point, ripped the veil off of any remaining veneer that that somehow would cloak the fact that we have a much deeper problem in America in dealing with and dismantling 400 years of systemic racism, inequities, and the compounding negative effect of all of that exponentially. So I think all of that said, more than anything, I truly believe there is a certain epiphany, a certain recognition that we all as individuals have come to see throughout all of this. And that is our voice matters. What we say and how we relate to our friends, to our neighbors, to the stranger, to people who ought not be the stranger any further, really does resonate and really does have value and currency as we go forward and think about what our society will look like. So there is, to me, there is a bit of a silver lining here. If we can just push through the worst of this horrible, horrible time. And I also believe that there's a recognition that none of this is the work of a day. We're going to have to do the work, stay with it, and it's not always in the glare of headlines or Klieg lights, but it's just continuing to stay the course. And I think that is really the obligation that those of us who care about fulfilling America's true promise, that's our task. And we have to redouble our efforts to get there.
Well, I'm going to press all of you on specifics in a little bit in terms of best practices. But John, curious, as we all know, COVID has, kind of brought up an ugly side as well against Asian Americans, right? The rate of xenophobia and racist attacks against Asian Americans has been astounding. They keep on updating numbers. In California alone, now it's 1,000 attacks so far since March. Across the country, it's over 2,000. And it just keeps happening. It seems to be getting worse. So from an Asian American perspective, curious about what your thoughts have been when you've been hearing about this and reading about it. And, have you thought to yourself, what can be done? What would I do, to try to help in this situation? And in terms of maybe even policy, because you clearly were in government, so you know how that end of it works, right? So can you share with me, your thoughts on that?
And it's frankly why I got into government. The being the oldest son of parents who immigrated from Taiwan, they both wanted to become a surgeon, right? Because of cultural factors. We were the first Asian family in our community in suburban Chicago, and at age 6, 7, I remember being discriminated against. And it's very, very painful. And what was especially painful as I was growing older is people just blew it off, right? They challenged me. I was fortunate that our former insurance commissioner, Dave Jones, was a high school classmate of mine, and he said, no, the stories John talked about, ugly racial epithets spray painted on his garage, rocks, flying through the windows of his house are in fact true. And so that's why I became an elected official. The Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, I'm named after John F. Kennedy, were my childhood heroes, right? So I tried to address during my service, public service, the moral crisis that we face today, the economic, financial crisis, and the health crisis. Right? They're all inextricably tied together. And you have to do that from the basis of human dignity. So it's great to be on this panel with Richard and Reverend Smart from AJC and SCLC. They were instrumental in my public service career. One of the things I used to do every single year was pay tribute to Martin Luther King. And during my Board of Equalization years, I would do the MLK parade in the morning. I would watch Oprah when she was on TV, and I would go to the SCLC dinner, right? I thought there needed to be an Asian face to show that somebody was inspired by the movement, somebody is living that life, right? During law school, I was protesting South Africa, right? When I should have been studying, I was on the streets of DC protesting. And I wanted to thank Richard and AJC, Kathy Unger, Congressman Howard Berman, Len Unger, for giving me that opportunity to go to Israel. My mom used to, when she's talking about Jews, she used the Japanese word because Taiwan was under Japanese occupation, kaiso, kaiso. She felt sorry because, right, the hatred that was born upon Jews all across this world. And so, right, it's us coming together, using our force, using our power, using human dignity and decency, the way we treat each other, talking about how we work together to discuss today it's DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and what those public policy practices need to do, right? How do we make sure that we get everybody world-class access, education? How do we bring more broadband to all the communities today? How do we make sure that we have universal health care, right? How do you make sure that you have safer working conditions? All those can happen when you have organizations like NetKAL bringing us together and we say, hey, this is what we're gonna do over these days and weeks coming forward. Let's work with our elected officials, let's work with private sector leaders to talk about how we save our fellow human being.
And John, I so appreciate the fact that you are talking about your own personal experience growing up and how that impacted you to the point where that's why you wanted to run for office, right? To become a public servant. And so that's what I love about this as well, is that all of us represent different communities, right? And different ethnic communities, different, minority communities. And this is what it's all about, right? We all need to have these conversations and share our personal experiences so that there is a better understanding, not just within communities, minority communities, but then together we need to educate the broader public. Because I always say, if we don't get the message out, we can't expect the broader public to really know. They're not going to go read a book about it if they're not forced to, right? Let's be honest, right? So the fact that we're coming together to share our experiences and try to educate, I think that's so crucial. So Reverend Smart, I'm curious from your own personal experience as well, having gone through the civil rights movement and being a faith-based leader, and now seeing what's happening with Black Lives Matter, what do you specifically see that's different this time, that feels different? Is it bigger? Is it more powerful? Is it, because it's young people again, just like in the 60s, it was young people. Again, it's young people.
Yeah. I wanted to mention something earlier too, May, that you mentioned that have we seen this before? And it was in the 60s where we saw, we have a pandemic and an uprising. And in the 60s, we had a conglomeration of issues then too. I'm glad we had the war in Vietnam, we had the uprising, we had the civil rights movement, we had the women's rights movement. So all of that was going on in the 60s. And ironically, we're back here again. So to answer your question, two things are different this time. Number one, from my organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we are not, you know, there was always some strife, and it was John Lewis who really mediated this tension between the young and the old. In that day, SCLC was really a one-man leadership, and the younger people, SNCC and them, under the direction of Ella Baker, they had a group-centered leadership. And today you're seeing Black Lives Matter is basically a group-centered leadership, but we're in more of in partnership with them, and we're not fighting them. We're letting them lead in their area, and we fight and we work with them. I'll tell you later, we have several events together and we just founded a group of pastors that are in support of Black Lives, clergy in support of Black Lives Matter, because we just understand their young thought minds and their direction is very important. What we're fighting through them, and police violence. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is, when you look at the history of Los Angeles and you see three different times when there have been what we call uprising, and that was the Watts riots after police violence in 1965, 1992. What's his name? That
Rodney King.
Rodney King,
Mhm.
the Rodney King uprising. And what you saw in those two uprisings, you saw 98% African Americans on the streets uprising. This time, George Floyd, you're seeing 70% of non-African Americans out there in the streets. That's significant because people again have gotten the point. So it's more than just a racial uprising. It is a human uprising to saying that we're sick and we're tired of what's going on. Those are the two big differences this time. That Portland, Oregon, 12% African American. We see, but what you see up there, you see young whites, middle-aged whites, fighting for righteousness and fighting for Black lives that matter.
Right. This is definitely much more universal, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, when the height of the protests, I read that there were protests in all 50 states, and then something like 13 countries around the world. So it was beyond just an African American issue. It was really about, yes, justice and respect for human life. Richard, if I can turn to you, the JLC, but the Jewish community on the whole, they have been so successful in terms of galvanizing their influence and power and being very organized in the way that they not only just promote the community, but also are able to get their messages across politically, socially, culturally. Can you tell us specifically how has your community been so successful? What are the practices that have been used to be able to gain that influence and sustain it? Because here's the thing, we're all talking about the movement, right? A movement can only keep going if it's sustainable, right? So Richard, if you can talk on that for us.
Of course, and I will say that the American Jewish experience, so the experience that Jews have had in this country for 350 plus years, in comparison to centuries of persecution and hate, America really has been a golden land. They call it a golden Medina for Jews. We have always gone about, this is true of AJC and other organizations, we have always gone about the specific task and challenge of working to secure the freedoms, the rights, the safety, and the status of our community with really a dual purpose, a dual vision, frankly. And that means fundamentally that unless other groups, all minorities, in our society are able to enjoy and avail themselves of protection and opportunity, then the Jewish community is not safe. So we really view this task as really working to fulfill the true promise of America for safety and security and equal opportunity for all in this country. And I don't think there's necessarily a magic formula here. It is simply to say that this is very much about organizing, establishing relationships, building allies, being an ally, and having allies. And I think that's a model that certainly applies and is transferable to the Korean American community, the larger Asian American community. And it's about making your voice heard, building relationships with elected officials, building relationships in your own community in terms of just it all, the former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, used to say all politics is local. And honestly, relationships ultimately begin in our own communities. It's about building relationship with law enforcement and just making sure police who are sworn to protect and serve know your community, know the community, understand what anti-Semitism is and its many manifestations. And we've seen that certainly from the physical, the most horrific attacks, looking back at Pittsburgh almost 2 years ago, and then Poway a year later, really the most horrific, most violent and murderous attacks against Jews in our history in this country. That, in many respects, was a wake-up call, that even with the advances that we have made and the relationships we have built and our full participation in our democracy, voting, expressing, advocating, still there are those who hate and those who will not in any way be bashful about expressing their hate through violence. And so there is a certain common denominator that each of our communities share, in that bigotry ultimately is indivisible. And we have to stand up and stand out and raise our voices whenever we see hate, wherever we see hate, because the next victim may be us. And that's a lesson we simply, that's too great a price that any of us should ever have to pay.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I can't believe that it's 2020 and we are talking about these issues of severe racism and now open racism that's still taking place and seemingly feels like it's getting worse in our current climate. So that's disheartening. But as you said, Rick, I mean, it is about raising our voices and building allyship, I think is crucial. We hear that now more often than we did in the past. So John, when it comes to the Asian American community, and then for me as a Korean American, specifically Koreans, and obviously this is a NetKAL event, Asians, I think, still feel to a certain extent that they don't have as much influence, that their voice is not as loud, perhaps, as other minority groups and other communities of color. And that obviously has to do with numbers to a certain extent, right? I mean, I have some stats. The Korean American population is almost 2 million. The Asian American population is 20 million plus. And then the Jewish population is 8 million. African American is 42 million. So there's a huge difference in terms of numbers in this country. So that has something to do with, obviously, the level of influence, right? There's power in numbers. But is there something else that you've noticed being part of the Asian American community and, of course, in politics that is being sort of overlooked? Or is there something that the Asian American community can do more of that they're not doing right now?
So politics is the exercise of power, and the Asians haven't exercised their power to the extent that they need to. So whether it's getting out to vote, whether it's getting in the faces of elected officials, whether it's building the coalitions and the partnerships right? This is NetKAL. We have so many compelling stories of NetKAL members who are doing great things, the things that we are talking about what needs to be done, whether it's Carol Kim and Paul Song trying to fight for universal access for people of all colors, backgrounds, economic status, getting access to healthcare. Patrick Chung, who's the CEO of Zeus Technologies, the company I sit on the board, talking about corporate leadership. I spent a disproportionate amount of time with Patrick talking about how he wants to get larger African-American economic ownership of our company, right? Trying to engage, right? Trying to reach out to the community, talking about financial tools to empower Zeus, right? And with the African-American community. As you pointed out in your initial comments, which are so persuasive, we need to control the narrative, and we need to control the means and mechanisms to get these stories out so that people know that Asian Americans, Korean Americans are exercising leadership, and that all communities need to be supporting them. Because if you're supporting these types of efforts, you're going to see extraordinary progress happen in our communities.
Right. I do wonder though, because, you know, I observe this so seriously, obviously, because this is something of interest to me, but I do also wonder though, is, you know, are Asians still in a place where they feel like their voices aren't going to be heard? So therefore they're not making enough noise, right? I mean, that's why I give credit to the Jewish community and the African-American community. You guys know how to make noise, and you're getting the attention, you're creating noise, you know, and so therefore you have a lot more influence. Is that something that, you know, needs to be taken seriously by the Asian American community in terms of kind of breaking out and really just pushing the boundaries a little bit more? John.
Absolutely. We haven't done far enough of that, right? You have a stirring of that conversation, but we have to understand that you're going to get a lot of pushback, and you're going to fail dramatically. But you got to keep failing and failing before you succeed. This is like Abraham Lincoln, right? You got to fail 10 times before you prevail. And just within institutions, you look at the major media publication in Southern California, the Los Angeles Times, right? The Latino Guild, the Latino reporters are pushing back because they don't think the Latino community, Latinx community, is getting their fair shake and the stories are being told adequately.
Right.
So when you're thinking about that happening, right, we ought to be following these other models and saying, if we're not following their leadership and exercising our own leadership, right, we're going to continue to be way behind, to the detriment not only of those individual reporters, the individual community members, but as a community as a whole, right? We disproportionately carry a larger burden because we don't get business support, we don't get political support, we don't get NGO support.
Here's a question to all of you, and then I'll call on each one of you to give me your ideas. But there's also the issue of minority communities not working with each other. And we've been talking about this, right? It needs to be a coalition. There needs to be solidarity. But let's be honest, there is still clear divisions between different minority communities. There's been conflict in the past. There still is today. There's tensions. And, you know, they come up when there are, you know, incidents like the protests in LA in 1992, and then a little bit, you know, this time around as well. So what is the anecdote to that in terms of trying to bridge the differences between communities of color so that we can have that allyship that Richard, you mentioned, instead of having these differences and these divisions still? Reverend Smart, do you have any idea?
Yeah. Can I go back to the question you were talking to John first about the Asian community and whether or not its voice is there, but you know, the Asian community is diverse too.
Yes.
So in 2016, I was at the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia. And if you know me, you'll know that I'm going to be around every place. So I went to a reception for an elected official, and they weren't raising money. They were just acknowledging this elected official. And he was a Chinese elected official. And but there were all the Asian community came together to recognize him. And they said, and I said, oh, this guy's going to run for governor of California. And some of the guys there, and men and women there, say, yeah, but he's going to be out the first Asian American president. We're going to see to that. And it was John. Okay, and I'm just saying how they were building support then in 2016. Looking, John, you were, of course, you were there. Looking beyond. I mean, I'm just saying the organization I saw that me and my partner, as we left, we were talking about how organized they were, and on a national level. So there may be here and there weaknesses, but they too impressed me as a very organized body that they said they were, that was something they were working on then. Now, John, I don't know where that is, and down the line, you probably come back and do that, but I'll support you. But I'm just saying, so your question is, SCLC, under my leadership, we founded the Black Jewish Justice Alliance that is going strong. And it happened in a meeting of African American pastors when we were talking about what do we need to do. And two of them said that one of the things we need to build one of our old alliances again. And that was the alliance we had with the Jewish community. And from that, and we went to work, and we have accomplished a lot as an alliance together. That's one time that, and so those are the types of things you have to do. You have to build coalitions. And you're right, because we're going to have our annual King Hirschhaut or something, and we always get it different. It's Hirschhaut King or King Hirschhaut forum soon. And one of the things we're going to be talking about, me and another rabbi friend of mine, we're going to be talking about the historic relationship between Jews and African Americans. And, it's not, it hasn't always been a great relationship at times, but it's not where you necessarily come from. It's where you want to go together. It's moving forward together. And history you have to talk about, or you don't have to talk about. You can talk about the positive things and move on those things. And that's how we're doing. We're going to have, SCLC is sponsoring a week of activities around in 3 weeks around the March on Washington, the 57th. One of the first things we're going to do on Monday, we're going to talk about our Asian allies. We're going to be talking about racism toward Asians because of the COVID-19. And, we were beginning to talk about that in February and March when the city council members were concerned about that. And the racism, every time bigotry rises, I represent an organization, Dr. King, who always fought against these things. And so I am compelled to do that now.
Great. I'm so glad to hear that. Richard, going along the same lines in terms of how allyship can be built. And Reverend Smart just brought up a really good point, which is, Asians have to be brought into the fold, and again, in the past, I've experienced that Asians often are never mentioned, right? When people talk about different communities, they talk about African Americans, Jewish community, Latino, and then the Asians are never mentioned. Because we have always had this label of the model minority. We all know this, right? The model minority myth. And so within Asian communities, we say the model minority, it works for the general public because it fits a certain, stereotype where we're good citizens, we don't make any noise, where we kind of work hard and all of that, until it doesn't. And COVID has proven now all of a sudden we're the enemy, right? We're bringing this virus. The Jewish community, to a certain extent, in some ways has gone through that as well. the Jewish community has been seen as sort of also model minority until they're not, right? For other purposes. So from your perspective, how does one fight that and try to, get over that kind of obstacle?
Well, I think to even the earlier question you asked, the point you were making about the occasional friction between minority groups and ethnic groups, I think we have to be very careful and very cognizant that our interests, none of our interests, individually or collectively, are served by sparring with one another. And that simply just doesn't advance the cause of equal opportunity or safety or fairness for any of us. So I do think we need to, it goes back to being allies and being there for one another. And it means paying attention, keeping our ear to the ground when there are hate episodes or bias incidents against any of our communities. It means showing up for one another. One of the most profound experiences that I've had in my life, in my career, and personally as well, took place almost 20 years ago when I was living in the Chicago area. And over the course of one weekend, happened to be the 4th of July weekend in 1999, a white supremacist went on a murderous shooting rampage that took the life of the former men's head basketball coach at Northwestern University, Ricky Birdsong, that targeted members of the Jewish community, many of whom were gravely wounded, but all survived. And then the rampage ended, started on a Friday evening, ended on a Sunday near Bloomington, Indiana, where a Korean American graduate student by the name of Won Jun Yoon was gunned down. And that, for me, encapsulated the indivisibility of hate and bigotry. And that whole summer, in fact, was later dubbed the Summer of Hate. Why? Because 6 weeks later, a dyed-in-the-wool white supremacist by the name of Buford Furrow went on a murderous rampage here in Los Angeles, attacking the North Valley JCC, shooting at young children, then went on about and took the life of a Filipino-American postal worker by the name of Joseph Eleto, and ultimately was apprehended. And so we all have a shared stake and an equal stake in seeing to it that we are safe in America and that we are represented and heard in America. And so it is so important that we not allow petty disputes or at times ignorance to get in the way. When I speak of ignorance, I'm speaking about some of the, we're living in a very different era. I'm very excited to hear Pastor Smart talk about the annual Heschel King or King Heschel event and to restore the historic bonds between our communities. But I am much more concerned today when a Deshaun Jackson with millions of followers or an Ice Cube with millions of followers on social media starts spewing anti-Semitism. And we heard it even 2 weeks ago from the likes of Nick Cannon, who, God bless him, in the 2 weeks since has had an absolute epiphany and done an about face and even fasted on the Jewish holiday of Tisha B'Av just days ago, which marks the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. So my point here is, I think we have, and my tangent here, forgive me, is that we have a very clear and present need and imperative to reach this younger generation, some of the same folks who have justifiably taken to the streets to march for fairness and human dignity, and to recognize we will not get there if we are going to resort to scapegoating or not do the work of really understanding the history of our respective communities and how intertwined we really are with a common fate and destiny.
Thank you for your tangent, Richard, because I think it was worthwhile. I think you bring up a really interesting point of the fact that people tend to jump at any sort of misinformation in our age, right? Because of social media, because of news outlets, or look, I'm part of the media too, and there are mistakes made. There's misreporting constantly taking place because we now live in an age of rapid information, right? Everybody wants to get something out first, and they need to make headlines, and they just need to make waves. And so that is obviously adding fuel to this growing fire that we're witnessing and experiencing in this country. John, so I wonder from a political point of view, uh, does change, because often we talk about politics, right? We talk about how policy needs to change and we need better representation in government. So is that part of a greater answer to solving some of these major issues that we're now grappling with? Is it politics? Is it better representation? Is it people needing to vote? Simple as that, just vote.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we know the powerful entrenched special interests, especially those with large sums of money, have a disproportionate influence over our policymakers. One of the things we have to be very concerned about going forward is the algorithms. Who writes the algorithms? Is there going to be implicit bias in those algorithms? Another NetKAL person, Kevin Kim, and his wife Claire is working with Andrew Yang and others to try to get some of those privacy rights restored to people's individual use, right? If Google and Facebook and others are gonna make billions based on our own private information, why shouldn't we get that money back, right? We ought to be supporting Kevin and Claire and other people's efforts to get that information, because we know it's disappointing watching Mark Zuckerberg recently, right? Facebook pushes a lot of the virality out there, and it's a lot of that is hate language, right? That whatever's more controversial gets more attention instead of what's decent, what's right? We need those types of voices challenging the current practices. And so one of the things I pushed when I was the state controller, later state treasurer, is to diversify America's private sector leadership. In my second year in office, I said we need more African Americans, Latinx, Asians on corporate boards, right? A couple years later, we need more women on corporate boards. We need more people of the LGBTQIA people on corporate boards, right? Diverse skill sets, people with more climate change risk expertise, right? We need to bring that diverse perspective that's going to be more representative of different perspectives onto America's private sector leadership that will finance these activities. One of the great things after Charlottesville is to watch those private sector employers fire the employees who they saw, right, supporting white supremacy, right? That will send a clear economic signal. America's not going to support bigotry, right? And then if, like, I watched Robin Roberts on Masterclass, right? She talked about she said, Robin asked her mom, why are all our kids, even though we didn't come from a wealthy background, high performing? And she said, I taught you good manners, right? When you get taught good manners, fundamental dignity for each other, right? That's a good premise. And unfortunately, right, we lost a lot of those good manners. We lost civic engagement. We lost a sense of community. And that's why these organizations, right? You bring NetKAL, AJC, SCLC together, you start putting members together, working on partnerships, putting each other on boards, supporting each other for nonprofit boards, private sector boards, right? We will make progress, right? When we start thinking in that fashion and taking leadership of politics, the private sector, NGOs, to make sure that good things are pushed forward and we're going to push down bad actors, that's the progress we need today.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said, John, about the importance of private sector participation, right? Because as we know, corporations are extremely powerful and they're getting only more powerful. Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all of those guys. And so for them to show some leadership in terms of better ethics, morality, and civic duty, they can certainly make a tremendous difference. And we're seeing that with the Black Lives Matter movement, where you're starting to see corporations say, okay, we're supporting this openly. We're going to boycott Facebook. And well, that was, I think, I'm not sure of how much of an impact that has, but still they're trying to start saying, okay, we're going to take a very public stand when it comes to issues that matter. So that's certainly an improvement. Reverend Smart, this leads me to a question for you particularly. John mentioned, we're losing kind of the whole idea of civility and, good behavior, good manners. To me, as a woman of faith, I feel like it's a loss of spirituality. I feel like the soul of this nation is withering, and so we're losing the sense of morality and ethics and just treating one another with kindness. And I just wonder, from your faith-based background, do you think it's because we're just not spiritual anymore, or is it just, I don't know, we've lost our moral compass to a certain extent?
Yes, that's you saying that, what can I say? But yes, I've been a pastor for 53 years, 54 years. And so, yes, since I was 9 years old, yes. And I can remember it. I really remember when it began, this shift in that, when we took, and I'm a liberal and I'm coming from that lens, but I remember when we took prayer out of the school. I was a representative because I was student council president. There was only 2 high schools in our town. So I was one of the student representatives on the school board, and I was fighting, no, you can't do this. They were coming from a legal perspective, but you can't take prayer out of the school. But from an African American tradition, we've always been religious people. We've always have it. And when you begin to separate us from that, you'll see, you lose your essence of who you are. And so a lot of times when we see what's going on in all of America right now, people are losing their essence, and what they're finding a lot of times does not appropriate for what they lost. And so we have to go back to some form of worship, but we also have to come and find a moral high ground to live by. And that is what we say, what we do, who we affect with our words that we say. And sometimes when people are trying to do the righteous things, we can come and say little things to nag them, to pull them back to where they are, and where they shouldn't be. And so one of the forces we have to look at is the bully pulpit in America right now, and what's coming out of there. I mean, to me, that's one of the elephants in the room right now. And you have to address that we don't have moral leadership coming from the White House, and that's causing, we're having someone who has created an environment where people feel it's conducive to talk to each other every way, and to this whole white supremacy, and that we are the master race. And all of this is coming forth because of how he is governing in that bully pulpit. Sorry, I said it.
That's okay. This is what this is for. And, I'm all about being honest and truthful and genuine. So I appreciate it, Reverend, seriously. But you're right. Religion also can be very divisive, right? And can be used as a weapon to divide. And we've seen that certainly in this day and age. So I love the fact that you're saying that it's just a moral high ground. It doesn't matter what faith you are and what spiritual background you have. We're losing the moral high ground in terms of, just being kind and being treating others the way you want to be treated. It's the golden rule, right? So Richard, I'm wondering from your perspective as well, is this something that is not being addressed enough? Because as Reverend Smart, Pastor Smart said, things are being normalized that probably should not be normalized by leadership and other people who have some influence. So
I couldn't agree more with Pastor Smart as well as with John. I think we have not been living in an America over the last 3.5 years that most of us recognize, or that most of us see as a place that is welcoming to all. Charlottesville was mentioned a few minutes ago, I think by John, and I'm not sure we have ever gotten over as a country the notion of good people, fine people on both sides. It's simply that was the beginning of the normalization of white supremacy, or the reemergence of white supremacy, and the words that are spoken by authority figures, by elected leaders, have consequences. They matter. And time and again, we've heard from that highest bully pulpit, from the Oval Office. When we think about COVID, we've heard the slurs and the blaming and the scapegoating. I won't dignify those slurs by repeating them here. I always hope and wish, and perhaps it's just, it comes with my faith. We have a certain eternal optimism that that once and for all, we may have heard it for the very last time. Untrue. As recently as yesterday, it was uttered yet again. And these are the kinds of words that have consequences. I still think about early on in this COVID era, picking up the LA Times, reading a story about 22-year-old Natalie Chow, who is a standout women's basketball player at UCLA, being fearful about walking her dog in her neighborhood in Dallas, where she was back with her family, but fearful about walking the dog in her neighborhood because of being blamed and scapegoated and, God forbid, attacked because of the virus, the coronavirus, before we were really calling it COVID-19. That is simply outrageous and simply unacceptable in the America that we know we truly are.
right.
So I have to offer the disclaimer that AJC, may be hard to believe I'm going to say this based on the comments I've just made, AJC is a non-political, nonpartisan organization, but we do have opinions, and we do follow bigotry and hate wherever it leads, and we will speak out about it unequivocally and unapologetically. And we fervently wish for better days in America starting next January.
Richard, honestly, I don't even look at that as a political statement that you're making. I'm going to share my own opinion about this. I think we're beyond politics when we're talking about the behavior of what's happening in this country and from leadership. It's not about politics. It's about decency. It's about civility. And that is what we're questioning. And that has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with being a human being that God created, and we were supposed to be put on this earth to do good and treat each other with kindness and, do what's right. And that's being turned on its head. Right from wrong is being questioned, truth versus lies. I mean, so I think it's beyond politics at this point. So your disclaimer, I accept, but at the same time, I don't think it was very political. I think you were just talking about just values in general. So,
and let me, if I can add, I don't mean to go on too long, but one of the lessons that and sort of epiphanies that I have had in the post in the era since the tragic murder of George Floyd is really, if we could turn this back just for a moment to law enforcement and criminal justice and the role of police in our society. And one of the questions I had in the conversation I had with a new friend was simply to pose whether or not police view themselves as accountable to the African American community? And I felt that that was a question to pose. And my friend enlightened me by sort of changing the narrative of that question. It's not about being accountable, it's about being responsible for. And if we look at policing through the lens of who those who are sworn to serve and protect are ultimately responsible for and responsible to, I suppose that's accountable for, but really responsible for, it changes the paradigm entirely. And that's a start point. This is, you will not find AJC carrying placards calling about defunding the police. It's really more about reimagining the police. And even in Los Angeles, in the last few days, the expansion of the community safety partnership, which is really community policing at its best, the promotion of an African-American sergeant to the rank of deputy chief among several deputy chiefs, and the redirecting of resources to not viewing every societal ill or social problem as a public safety matter, that I would argue is at least a step in the right direction. And that's where we need to be moving. And that's where we need to be joining voices and locking arms to make that a reality, to make it a permanent reality.
Yes.
Yeah, sometimes, but you know, Rick, sometimes things can happen so many times. You know, ever since 1992, I mean, beyond 65, the commission then, McCone Commission, and all of the commissions, it's been reforms. Sometimes people get sick and tired. Well, Black folks get sick and tired of even seeing changing in the window dressing. We have to see a new body. We have to see a new process. So I haven't been one that's been excited about that. It's just, you have to, I've seen it before, and a theme I have is sometimes same game, name change. Let's just see it. Let's just see the process, not all the advertising about it. Let's see the results. Yeah. Before, so I'm not excited about that right now. I want to see the results because we've seen it before. I'm sorry to get off.
No.
I would say what struck me as significant, Pastor Smart, was simply the allocation of significant resources, more than just an expansion. Literally, a lot of man and women power and dollars directed in that realm, and hopefully it will make a difference. Hopefully, along with the new Civil and Human Rights Department, it's a commission, but it's really a department within the city, that as well as we've got to give it a try. And I think our job, to your point, is to be tenacious in monitoring and cajoling and ensuring that this isn't just window dressing, isn't just a PR stunt for the moment. That's really where the real work has to happen, I believe.
Yes, exactly.
And as we were all saying in the beginning, it takes voicing our concerns, but it also takes everyone together pushing for that kind of change and for real change instead of just talk. And so, as you said, Pastor Smart, earlier, the difference between the 60s and now is that you're seeing the global community, communities from all walks of life coming together for the same purpose, instead of just the African-American community that, was the case in the 60s. So let's hope that kind of, greater movement is going to push for that permanent change on all levels. I have a couple of questions from the audience that were sent in earlier. And so I want to round off this conversation with maybe posing these questions to you. So one of them comes from John Rhee. He's a writer-director. And he says, what are some things your community is doing to foster the next generation? How important is this? And, we were talking about young people being involved in the movement, but I think that is really crucial. We can't just talk about all of these things and not really focus on how we shape these future leaders and exactly what we can do to further that. So, John, maybe I can start with you and we'll go around.
So it's not only the Asian American community. I always try to put people in positions of responsibility that were more elevated than any opportunities that I was given. As I tell young folks, do your best, explain the process, and you're allowed to make mistakes when you're young, because when you're older, and it's your name on the door or your name that ends up in some media publication, you could be gone very quickly. So to advance people of all backgrounds to create a better society, I try to elevate them in regards to responsibility. There's nothing like being given leadership positions early. That's what's happened to too many people in our community. They never see the light of day for a leadership position.
Okay, great advice. Pastor Smart, how about you?
We have developed a Young Dreamers for Justice. Well, it's called MLK Dreamers for Young Dreamers for Justice, and they are a cadre of from 9 to 17, and they work on projects, but they learn from the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King. They have been out there and working with our Poor People's Campaign. They have on Thanksgiving and Christmas, they gave away toys. They gave away food at Christmas and Thanksgiving, and they have met and they have learned how to work together. They have learned how to live and create a new world, and they're bringing about in their own way. They're multiracial, religious, and they're learning how to create Martin Luther King's beloved community, bringing that to pass.
That's great. That's great. Richard, how about you?
So, Pastor Smart, I'm hoping we can create a coalition even before this panel ends. We have a program at AJC called LIFT, and the acronym is Leaders for Tomorrow. It is primarily high school students, and it's a way to help open their minds and their eyes to the complexities of the world, particularly for many of these young people, if they are able to go on to college or university, to prepare them for the opportunity to enlarge their circle and to get to know people who are different from them, who may not be from the same community, who may not be of the same faith, and to find ways to engage and become as much of a global citizen as possible. So I'm already, as you were describing that wonderful program, I'm already thinking there may be a Sunday down the road, God willing, not virtually, where we might be able to bring our communities together and further this dialogue and ultimately reinforce that we've got to reach across and embrace what is unfamiliar to us. And if we can do that, we can break down some of that, natural human tendency to fear what we don't know and who we don't know. And that, I think, is a way early on to build bridges and break down walls.
It's what you were saying, John, before about sharing stories, right, with people outside your community and whatever form that comes in. Just a little bit of information, just a little bit of education to somebody who maybe never would have been exposed to that can make a world of difference in understanding. It's amazing when you can see someone's mind change once they just get a little grasp of a world that they weren't familiar with before. And as a journalist, I see that all the time because my job is about storytelling. So I'll add to this conversation. What gives me hope is when I do my show, when I talk about issues that matter, I get so much email and Instagram posts and messages from young people listening to this 54-year-old woman, but saying, thank you for saying that message. It's giving me hope. I want to keep doing my work. I want to be active. I want to use my voice. that gives me hope. And they're all young. And so that's something that I feel like, wow, if we can continue cultivating that in all communities, then we're going to be in much better shape. Last question. Another audience member who is anonymous. Where do you see racial relations 20 years from now? Will it improve or will it worsen? I know this, nobody has a crystal ball, but let's talk about like what your thoughts are. John, we're going to go around the same way.
I'm very hopeful. As we become more integrated, you're still going to have a passionate, hopefully far smaller minority that is just bigoted, that is ignorant. But right, as we all pointed out, right, you see I have so much hope. That used to be me marching on the streets, and now you have more people marching on the streets from different backgrounds, different economic status, different heritage. Let's just keep building that.
Yeah. Pastor Smart, your thoughts on
my thoughts
where
is,
we're going to be in 20 years?
Well, it depends on some variables. It depends on, are we respecting each other more? Are we understanding each other more? Do we empathize with each other more? And do we accept each other's more? Those four variables, if they're better in place, race relations will be better.
Okay. All right. We got to keep that hope going then. Richard, you're last with this one.
Again, I think we have to push back against the erosion of civility in our society. I think the enduring message, I want to believe at least, coming out of the protests, coming out of people taking to the street, coming out of the terrible pandemic that we're living through, is that we really are all in this together, and that if we act any differently, we do so at our own peril, and we continue to see an America that is ripped apart at the seams. We have so much to celebrate in our diversity, so much to celebrate in the opportunity that America must bring to fulfillment for all. I want to believe, and I do believe, again, as an eternal optimist with a healthy dose of realism sprinkled in, that we're going to become a more empathetic and understanding and harmonious and compassionate society. If we don't get to that point, if we don't learn that lesson out of COVID, out of the horrors of racial injustice and the unmasking of what is a history of entrenched inequities and racism in this country, then we will have squandered this moment. I don't think we will. I think we're going to set ourselves on a much more positive and hopeful and genuine course for change, and that's part of the evolution of this country. 400 years is and 200 years is not such a long time in the grand scheme of history. So America is still a grand experiment, but we have a lot of work to do.
Well, Richard, from your lips to God's ears, I hope for all of that as well. I think we all do. Well, I want to thank all of you again for your patience because of the difficulties we had earlier this evening, but it was so worth it. At least personally, it was so worth it. I felt like this was such a valuable conversation in terms of all of you sharing your different thoughts, insights, experiences. So thank you so much for giving so much of your time. And
thank you for your patience.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
It's my job, and I can kind of deal with any sort of circumstance being a journalist, but I just am so grateful to all of your participation in this. So John Chiang, Richard Hirschhaut and Reverend William Smart, all of you, please stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope the next time we can all meet face to face and have another great discussion. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Looking forward.
Okay, now we're going to go to the next panel that is really going to focus some of these ideas really on the Korean and Korean American community and how they can execute some of these concepts to galvanize our influence and empower each other and build leadership and change. So stay tuned for that panel coming up right now.
Hi, everybody. It's David Kim, Secretary of the California State Transportation Agency and longtime NetKAL participant. Greetings from Sacramento. I'm so very sorry I can't join you on a live video conference today due to my schedule, but big thanks to NetKAL for the invitation to join you. And I also want to say what a terrific lineup of speakers you've organized for today's conference. So glad to see on the last panel my good friend John Chiang, and on this panel some outstanding individuals, people I've known for a long time, Paul Song, John Lim, Sonia Logman, who's a great colleague of mine here in the Newsom administration, and of course, Roy Choi, who's moderating. All of them are terrific individuals, and you're going to hear some great insights from each of them. Now, I'm going to keep this brief in the interest of time. I just wanted to make a few points on the theme of today's panel. First, I think the Korean American community has come a long way in terms of making its voice heard in the political arena. If you look at where we are today compared to, say, 20 or 30 years ago, there is no comparison. Collectively, we are more sophisticated, better organized, and more energetic before, and motivated to make an impact and have our influence felt. But we still have a ways to go. And I always like to say that we are about a decade behind the Latino community when it comes to community organizing, political empowerment, and mobilizing a large swath of our community to really maximize the level of engagement within the community. To be honest, we still have many people who are either disinterested or completely disconnected to what's happening in the world. They are completely on the sidelines. But the good news is that's changing thanks to the younger generation that's coming up. So many of them are not only plugged in and politically aware, but they are heavily engaged as well. So that's a really hopeful sign for the future. And I think it's important for organizations like NetKAL, as well as others like CKA, KAC, NAKASEC, and others, to really bolster that sense of civic awareness and engagement among members of our community so that our voice can continue to be advanced in a way that reflects the growing reality of our community, the fact that we are growing so very rapidly. I also want to briefly touch on the importance of coalition building and working with other communities beyond our own. I've noticed that over the years, we have a tendency to be somewhat insular as a community, to stick to our own, so to speak. But there is strength in numbers, and I very much believe it's in our best interest to join forces with other communities that share common values and similar priorities. So that means building alliances with other AAPI organizations and coordinating with them on a more consistent basis. And beyond the AAPI community, we also need to step up our interaction with Black, Latino, and Jewish community leaders as well. Because if we're going to play a role in the multicultural landscape that defines not only Southern California, but the entire state and nation, we need to be an active part of it. Not just focus on our own community, but to expand our mindset and work hand in hand with other like-minded communities whose priorities and challenges are very similar to ours. So, for example, if we believe in Black Lives Matter, and I think many of us do, what should we as a community in NetKAL do? How do we play a meaningful role? Now, of course, educating our own community is a big part of it because, frankly, to be candid, there are some portions of our community that would not want to get involved. But if we assume that's a minority viewpoint, the question is, how do we stand up and add our voice to the Black Lives Matter movement? How do we add value? These are things worth discussing. I think the Black community needs to know we're with them, especially given the history of Korean-Black relations. Some of us are old enough to remember the 70s and 80s when tension between Korean American store owners and Black customers ran high. The relationship was bitter and unfortunately violent at times. Thankfully, that is no longer the case and tensions have largely disappeared. but there is so much more we can do to solidify the connection between our community and the Black community. So just like encouraging more Korean Americans to get engaged and get plugged in, when it comes to building enduring relationships with other communities, now's the time. And that's a responsibility for all of us, including organizations like NetKAL and others. So I'll leave it to that for now. Thank you so much for the time. I hope you have a wonderful conversation, and I really look forward to the time when all of us can get together in person when we get beyond this crisis and reach a post-pandemic world. Until then, stay safe and healthy, and I wish you all the very best. Thanks.
Well, thank you and welcome to the highly anticipated, once-in-a-lifetime world premiere of Unlocking the Korean American Community's Power and Influence in Mainstream America. I'm your moderator and least accomplished guest of the evening, Choi. We want to come away from today's panel with a better sense of what we're capable of as Korean Americans, not just to further promote our community's causes, but also our responsibility and connection to other communities. And having to do this, of course, in the middle of a pandemic and eventually in a post-pandemic world. We'll cover political influence, empowerment through nonprofit giving and participation. And finally, the topic that we want to talk about, that we need to talk about, BTS. Yes, BTS, but more broadly, the influence of Korean pop culture. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the work of NetKAL and the team that organized our event today, Yona Hong, John Rhee, Dr. Jeannie Choi, and Dr. Jae-Hoon Lee. NetKAL is the network of Korean American leaders, of which I am a fellow from the third class many years ago. My fellowship with NetKAL was one of the most valuable experiences that I had as a Korean American. So if you'd like more information on NetKAL and the fellowship, please go to NetKAL, netkal.org. Our first panelist is John Lim, managing partner at LimNexus, a leading minority-owned boutique law firm. John is also currently the chair of Korean Americans for Political Action. Corporate attorney by day, equal rights and justice superhero by night. Our second panelist is Dr. Paul Song, Vice Chairman and Chief Medical Officer of NKMax America. Paul has advocated heavily for healthcare and equal rights for all. He is also the second tallest Korean American I know. Yeah, this is tough to do without laughter. I should have added some laugh tracks, huh? And our final panelist is Angela Killoren, Chief Operating Officer for CJ E&M America, overseeing the US interests of their Korean parent company, CJ Entertainment. CJ, of course, the company behind the incredible Oscar-winning film Parasite. She also helped launch NetKAL as its first associate director. Welcome, everyone. How you doing?
Great to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks,
I'd
Roy.
like to start with, and we can go in order of how you were introduced. I'd like to start with, what are the issues most important to you today?
Well, I think the issues that are important to me are shared by a lot of people nowadays. Obviously, the health issue is a huge issue for all of us. Help to find a pathway to deal with that in a safe way. Right now, well, I hear dog barking. It's hard to compete with a dog and defining what are the most important issues nowadays. For me personally, I am a partner at a law firm, so I want to make sure that everyone within the firm are safe, and we're implementing all the protocols that are appropriate to keep the operation safe and strong. Obviously, resulting from the pandemic are other bigger issues like the economic issues and employment issues and so forth. So those are all, I'm sure I share those issues with other people on this panel.
Thanks, John. Paul?
Well, obviously right now during the pandemic, I think it's consuming everything, and it's also highlighting so much that's wrong with our society. And then if you look at what countries like Korea have done right, it really further highlights the disparity in terms of the systems that we have. And if you look specifically here in the Korean community, you don't have to look too far to see all the shops that have recently closed, all the restaurants that have been in business for 20 plus years that have just closed, the number of Koreans who've lost their healthcare, and just the number of people who've lost their healthcare in general. Over 6 million people who got their healthcare through their employers no longer have health insurance. The number of people who are going to probably be kicked out of their apartments in the coming month, short of any legislation to stop that. These are things that are going to affect every community, but especially the Korean American community in LA, where we all live, because of the number of people that are small business owners and really were kind of managing businesses month to month. So we have no safety net for these people. We have no healthcare system for these people, and it's really, really sad. So I think if you see, there's a food bank that I work at most Saturdays that takes place in Koreatown, and when we started in March, we probably see about 600 families come in on a Saturday. We're now up to 1,400 people coming in on a Saturday to get food, and there's so many Korean Hanminis that show up with their shopping carts, and so this is something that is profoundly affecting all communities, but we don't have to look outside of our own community to see how devastating it is. So I think that's probably front and center the biggest thing that really concerns me and so many of you as well.
Thank you, Angela.
You know, it's partly work related, but I think there's a lot of people who've been saying that the pandemic isn't creating change, it's accelerating change. Structural changes, issues that were already there, maybe, you know, like underpinnings that were rotten, whatever. It's just hastening all the change that was underneath. And hopefully, you know, so on the media side, that's really impactful. It's changing directly about how people get messages, and you know, the role of social media versus traditional mainstream media and how that balance interplays. But I hope that also that, you know, people realize the importance of science, and there's an enemy that's not a partisan enemy. I'm not exactly sure how, you know, the coronavirus can be, you know, a political actor. It's time for people to really pull together and focus on what's important for our communities and rebuilding, instead of, you know, wallowing in the different corners, because there's not time to do that. So I'm just hopeful that despite the lack of signs otherwise, that maybe this is an opportunity to get past the log jams that we've had, and this is another accelerant to that.
Thank you. Thanks, Angela. You know, you mentioned media portrayal, and you know, Asians are in kind of in an interesting position there, because you know, you have the president calling it the China virus, and then you have like Paul mentioned before, you have Korea with these incredible numbers, you know, the way they're managing this pandemic. And I think when we talk about representation in the media, you know, one of the first things that comes to mind is political representation. How important is it? And we'll start with John. How important is it to have Korean Americans elected into office?
Well, that's a very good question and very important question, I think. We want to have a voice, and we want a seat at the table, and we want to participate in this democracy. I can share a little bit of my personal experience from back in 1992, during the LA civil unrest. You know, it started out as a protest for the century-old racial injustice and social injustice in Los Angeles and throughout the country. But what triggered was, of course, the two important legal cases that really brought about an outrage at just unbelievable level. And so when all that happened, what I saw was that the law enforcement abandoned us. We didn't have any voice in the LA City Hall. We didn't have connection to the mayor. And after the devastation, you know, it was pretty much left to the Korean Americans to undertake relief efforts. So happens that I was the president of the Korean American Bar Association at the time. So, you know, I spent pretty much the whole year doing pro bono work for the people who lost their businesses. And about 80 or so Korean American lawyers volunteered to join our team to support the relief work. And it was just an amazing endeavor. And, you know, at the time I would have hoped and wanted other communities to support us and work with us, but hopefully things have changed since then. But at the time we didn't get much support or partnership from others. So that really taught me an important lesson, and that is that we have to own some of these issues ourselves. We need to be prepared to deal with them, and having a political voice would be very helpful to deal with the Korean American issues. And I am certainly not saying that every Korean American political or elected officer would side with the Korean Americans issue on everything, but it would be helpful to have a voice in the mainstream with respect to these issues. And additionally, a Korean American in public office, I think, would be a great role model for Korean Americans. So that's another reason why I think it's good to have Korean American political leaders.
Well, you know, Paul, I know that I and, you know, many people you know have always talked about and have encouraged you to try to run for office. You're very active politically and have supported, you know, many candidates. What about candidates that you don't agree with politically, that are on the other side of the aisle? Do you support them?
Well, I try not to directly get involved to oppose them, but I will say that you have some examples of people, particularly in Orange County, who are Korean Americans or first generation Koreans who've immigrated here, who are now on the Orange County Board of Supervisors or who have been running for Congress. And I probably do not agree with them in a lot of their political positions, and especially one of the supervisors who referred to the virus as a hoax recently. But I do think that, like any group, we're not you know, all the same. And I think we do have differing political opinions within the Korean community. If you look at some of my parents' friends, they tend to be much more conservative. And so I do think we need to have people that reflect both sides of that, that look like us and have some common shared experience. And I think that while we may disagree with them on certain political issues, that some of their background certainly is important to have that perspective even guide their side of the aisle on their political issues. So I used to be to the point where I would consider even I've gotten to a point where I look beyond race, but I do think that we need to have people that reflect both sides of the aisle that are Korean American and not just people that we necessarily agree with.
Well, let me ask you in a different way. Would you support Korean American candidates if they were only in the other political party, your opposite political party? Would you then, if they were the only candidates?
No, but prime example, there's been some times where I've been asked to really actively campaign against somebody, and depending on who the candidate that was running, there have been some times where maybe I took a step back and was not as active as I normally would be. And it wasn't because I really liked or admired that person, but I think it caused a lot of conflict because of the friends that we all know that supported that person. So, I mean, it's a definite tough issue, but I think I've generally tried to vote for people that reflect what I believe in rather than them being Korean. And I think that's what I will always do. But at the same time, I don't mind seeing Koreans in Congress or in other offices who have a different ideology than I do, because I do think I'd rather see a Korean in that place than somebody who's not.
Yeah, I agree. I don't advocate for any of us to compromise our values and principles in the name of being loyal to a Korean American candidate. It's, you know, it's as important as it is to have a Korean American representation in politics. We have to stay true to our values personally. But at the organizational level, I think it may be a little different, because it's not a micro view, it's a macro view. And the reason for the strategic purpose approach, I think, is that the political landscape changes all the time. We have two parties in this country, and the parties that we need to have conversations with will change from time to time. And also, there's no assurance that the issue that's really important to you necessarily would be aligned with the party that you belong to. You know, for those of us who are very partisan, we'll be on autopilot in terms of supporting candidates. But I think it is important to understand that we have to be very strategic and smart about it, and be willing to work with both sides of the aisle at the macro level, at the organizational level. But individually, personally, I wouldn't write a check to a candidate that's on the other side of the party, but I would be willing to support an organization that could help the Korean American candidate who may not be aligned with my political values and ideologies.
How about you, Angela?
You know, it's interesting. It's always been about having a place at the table. So do you support people just because they're Korean American? It seems like a flimsy reason, but it seems to be why I write checks, right? You know, like people I know, oh, they're Korean American. Okay, let's at least support somebody getting there. And then the people who are in those positions, you recognize that regardless of which party they are, they're bringing a little bit of their Korean background, history, understanding of the community into the room with them. And that's all you can hope for, because there are so few. I mean, somebody all of us know very well, David Ryu. Now, I mean, I work in entertainment. He is the city councilman for a large share of the industry because of the districts that it covers. I'm like, you know, a block away from his district, but, you know, throughout Hollywood and Beverly Crest and Hancock Park, all these neighborhoods. And that's important, I think. So it's hard to say, you know, like, oh, just because they're Korean American, we should do it. But I think we've always said, well, somebody needs to have a place at the table, and whatever we can do to make that happen has been great.
So is that a sign of the times where we now have a choice to not support a Korean American candidate, whereas, you know, maybe 20, 25 years ago, you know, it was maybe a handful throughout the whole country, and where, you know, if word got out that there was a Korean American candidate somewhere, you know, support kind of flocked to that person. You know, does that mean we've made progress in the political arena when we've now chosen not to support Korean Americans in the other party?
I think it means that we've become more sophisticated in the political arena, and we want to support candidates that can really be our voice and not just the identity itself. I think that it's very important that the candidate is very well qualified. it's electable, and the person has real deep appreciation for our issues. The mere fact that the person shares our ethnic identity, I think, is not the material point. In fact, Korean Americans for Political Action are a 501c4 organization, which, by the way, is the sister of CKA, a group that all of you guys are part of. We went through a very extensive endorsement process and vetting process, and we have a written charter on this to make sure that we support only those Korean Americans that meet our requirements. And the identity itself and waving that flag is not going to get our endorsement and support.
So let's, we talk about political empowerment, representation.
Can I just ask a question though?
Yeah.
I have a slightly contrarian question, and I'm not sure if it's necessarily a measure of how far we've come that we have choice, or how bad partisanship has gotten. I mean, there's a statistic that people around the US, people are more willing to have their child marry somebody from another race than they are from another party. And that is not something that would have happened, I think, even 10 years ago. So I wonder if there's a little bit of that going on as well, because the fact is we still don't have, a wealth of Korean Americans or Asian Americans serving. Yeah. So I'm more of the opinion that we should still keep putting more people in the pipeline.
And I just want to say that, Roy, like as we as a community become much more involved in our communities, it's less about just what feeds the Korean American interest, and you look about issues of equality, whether it be marriage equality or whether it be Black Lives Matter or other fundamental inequalities that exist. And when you see a candidate who maybe is anti-gay marriage or speaks and says all lives matter, even if they're Korean, it's really hard for some of us to try to support that, because we are looking at a greater good of which the Korean community we'd like to think is part of, rather than just focusing on something that will highlight just our specific community. And that is the challenge. I'm just gonna be blunt with some of the candidates that are out there that are Korean. They have pretty far right views that I think are very hard to support.
And and my assumption here is that, the four of us are similar generation, and our parents' generation tended to be more conservative. What are we seeing with the generation below us?
So I recently just was asked to speak to a Korean congressional internship program. It's probably about 25 students that are doing virtual internships in various congressional offices from throughout the country. I was really just so proud to see these kids. This is what they wanted to do this summer, because I think many of us, when we were in college, this was never even an opportunity that was afforded to us. I remember when I was in college, the only people that went to work on the Hill were usually kids of wealthy donors to people who were elected. But to actually see lots of Korean Americans that really wanted to do that. And then what was also interesting about it is you had your conservative Korean Americans that were working for Republican legislators, and then you had, I'd say, 3/4 were more on the progressive side. And what I found in general with the millennials is that they tend to be much more concerned about the society as a whole rather than themselves. And so they were, at least the ones that were working here, were very concerned about the issues that we really are all faced right now. And with the coronavirus situation has really highlighted that in the George Floyd murder. But I think that in speaking to more and more students, I get the sense that they are far more to the center left than their grandparents were, our parents
are. When we talk about young people and I'm sure a lot of them will be tuning in to watch our panel. Their concerns growing up. So, young Korean Americans, growing up nowadays, very different from concerns that we had, right? We acted as translator for our parents. We struggled with trying to figure out identity, and maybe for some of us who grew up maybe in an all-white neighborhood, sometimes we look in the mirror and we're surprised to see this Asian face among a group of white friends. So, and I think that adds a little bit of grit to our experience as children of immigrant parents. Are young children missing that? Is it easier for them, or are they going through similar or equally difficult struggles?
I will just say this, and sorry to speak up again, but the one thing that I've noticed is when we all were growing up, we probably got into some fights, teased, called every Asian racial slur, and I kind of thought the kids growing up now were lucky because they didn't have to do that. But I have seen a rise in incidents due to the president calling this the China virus or Kung flu, of 20-year-olds now getting racially harassed in ways that I thought we had moved beyond, at least to the Asian American community. So I do think that this has brought back some of that. And when I hear and see the videos of these episodes, it really brings me back to that painful preteen time when I used to get teased a lot. So I don't think the Asians are out of the woods in terms of that difficulty because of what's happened with coronavirus.
I'd like to talk about other communities. Before that, though, our talk is aimed at Korean Americans and even non-Koreans who across the spectrum of socioeconomic status, political identification, geographic location. For a lot of them right now who are just trying to survive, what kind of message can you give them to where, what can they do? What are some practical things they can do to be more politically empowered? John, I'll ask you first.
Well, I think that it's really imperative that we form and establish an infrastructure that enables us to do the work that we can do and have influence. And that is another way of saying that we need to aggregate our resources. We need to converge into a platform that could have an impactful voice and get people to register and vote, and to be very systematic about this. I think you need an organization that can be completely devoted to this bipartisan effort or nonpartisan effort. And that's why I am very active and really work hard for Korean Americans for Political Action, known as KAPA. I think the time has come for Korean Americans to have a real presence in the political arena. And if we just try to do these things on our own, it just is not effective. So again, convergence and aggregation, I think, are the keys.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about other communities. This discussion we're having today about advancing Korean American interests, power and influence in mainstream America. We've been witness to this incredible movement in Black rights, and what are our learnings from that, and how do we support that? Well,
I'm a firm believer in consolidating forces. especially for racial justice, which is really dear to the Korean Americans as well. Whenever it's feasible and appropriate, we should come together, travel the journey together. We shouldn't go along when it makes sense to go together. But with that said, I think it is important to understand that we need to have the ability to go alone. And that's because there are some issues that are very dear to Korean Americans, and not that level of interest and passion is not shared by other groups. So again, go together when you can and it makes sense, but empower yourself to go alone when you need to go alone.
Do you think that Korean Americans in the past have not been as supportive as they could have been, whether it's Black rights or the rights of other minorities?
Yeah, you know, like I said earlier, I was there during the civil unrest in 1992, and the reactions of the Korean Americans at the time, I think, is somewhat, generally speaking, different from what I'm seeing today. And I think there's a greater appreciation for the political divisiveness that's coming out from Washington, and people are upset. And the other factor is that, you know, you have people like me who were much younger back then, and now, you know, we're older, and so the so-called the older first generation or 1.5 generation Korean Americans have a deeper appreciation for the racial injustice and social injustice issues.
Yeah, you know, so you mentioned that. I grew up in LA. I was here when the riots happened. I was 2 years old. No, I'm just kidding. I was a high school senior, and it was such a complicated time because, you know, I love listening to hip hop. I had Black friends, and it was a tough time for me at the time because my parents' business was in Koreatown, and you had Ice Cube, who was a big star that everyone followed, who was speaking out against Koreans, and so to have gone from there, that, like you mentioned, I think when you ask a lot of Korean Americans, the riots were the start of an awareness or understanding that you really need to have a seat at the table. So let's talk about how Korean Americans and even how Korea has treated Blacks, ethnic minorities, non-Koreans, and are we seeing, and maybe Angela, are you seeing that there's a change in the way that Koreans are viewing non-Koreans? I think there was a Black Lives Matter banner that went up near City Hall in Korea, in Seoul, Korea. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I know it made news, and I don't know if they took it down or if they kept it up there. But, I find it interesting because there are racial issues. Korea has its own racial issues that it deals with. And what are you seeing?
It's interesting. I mean, I think just to reverse a little or go back a little bit, you're talking about other communities, and I think what we're seeing is the people just in general, whatever community that you're part of, recognizing the increasing importance of allyship, right? You don't just come out on behalf of your own community, you have to show up for other communities as well. The biggest contrast, I think, at the beginning of this administration with the Women's March, which had such massive numbers, but how sustainable or how sustained was that versus the Black Lives Matter movements. You see, I don't know, just, from the footage, or if you go, like, there's obviously a lot of Black people, but everybody else is there as well, because we've all recognized in this intervening time, we need to show up for each other. So in regards to that, I think the Korean community, and I mean, just specifically on, speaking of NetKAL, right? We wanted to come out with a statement of support, and it flipped very quickly from, is that our wheelhouse? Are we supposed to say that? Like, is it, are we allowed to do that? Because, in many ways you kind of try to be neutral so that you choose to only, speak when it's important. And then it very quickly accelerated to, no, we have to. This is, you have to take a stand because you're taking a stand for yourself as well as everybody else as well. And I'm not sure that that level of understanding or nuance is present in Korea. I think what's happened is more fan driven, and that has to do, interestingly, even though it's so much associated with K-pop, who comprises the K-pop fan of the United States? It is not Korean Americans. It is not even majority Asian American. It's completely diverse, heavily multicultural, African American, Hispanic, Asian American, you know, Caucasian, all of that have you. But a remarkable group of people who are getting, you know, grow larger and larger every day, who have a genuine passion for something that's in a different language from another country. And so that kind of sense of openness and ability to, you know, empathize, I think is key, and allows for the allyship that, you know, that they're able to bring to bear. And then on top of that, they're bringing all their K-pop organizing skills, which are badass. So I think, you know, they have a lot to teach what young people can do if you really focus your mind to it. It's not just organizing a flash mob. Like, they are able to, if it's possible, you know, if, you know, more older or traditional organizations which have a certain way of doing things can combine the energy with, it's a slightly looser, more decentralized organization, the way that we see, you know, Black Lives Matter succeeding. You know, each can influence the other positively. We can take a little bit more action more quickly than we thought we could, and it can last a little bit longer than I think, you know, social media, viral media is used to.
Yeah, the Korean economy, if I may add, is number 12 in the world. Its GDP is, and as Korea has really participated in this globalization and free trade, the CEOs and the upper management, many of them have been educated in the U.S. and it's really a no-brainer for them to understand that if you want to do business with foreign countries and those countries look different from you and they have different culture, you need to embrace the differences, and you need to embrace the diversity, and you need to be inclusive to have a meaningful opportunity to compete. And so it's part of it, I think, is really economic driven. And CJ is a great example of that. Right, Angela?
CJ, you know, Angela, you and I had the good fortune of working on KCON a few years back in the good old days when large crowds were allowed to gather, right? Seems like a distant memory. What would you estimate was the percentage of Koreans that you would see? I guess you have to say Asian, just because, you know, you're not able to take
Yeah, so we were fairly diligent about doing surveys. So, you know, based on social media and all of our convention tickets, and our fans would always respond. So we had, you know, like a sample size of 4,300 people answering a survey, which is very large. And over time it changed a little bit, but we had about 35% Asian American, which is huge, right? Because Asians are obviously not 35% of the population. So compared to any place else you would go, you'd go like, wow, this is really Asian, but we know. That meant that the remaining 65% was everybody else. But we over-index on minorities because, and when you're in New York, there's more African Americans. When you're in LA, there's more Latinos. So it represents who the young people are and the diversity that's there.
Yeah, you talked about earlier. You talked about, you know, the openness and the type of fan, and I think Paul, you touched on it too. You know, that type of fan who's, you know, open-minded, listening to music in another language, and following artists that don't look like them. You know, we heard about the Trump rally where apparently tickets were reserved by apparently K-pop fans, are we seeing a new campaign weapon or other method of influence using K-pop or Korean pop culture?
Possibly. I mean, I alluded to, I hope this is something more sustainable. And, I wonder actually how Paul or John think of how this can be harnessed, or, not harnessed as a tool, like it's not like you're using them, but how it can kind of collaborate and come together. In the first instance, it really was led by BTS. BTS came out, very unusual for a Korean artist, saying, I support this, I'm putting money behind this.
Mm-hmm.
Korean artists generally tend to shy away from anything political because it's, not good business. And then that got ARMY behind them, the BTS fan club. So that was huge. But I think, and then they kind of self-organized from there. But what more can we do, I think, is the more interesting thing.
Yeah, I guess if you're going to run for president, you get BTS's endorsement first, right? It's interesting. I think first how far K-pop has come from, decades ago. But once they get to superstar status, you see them shy away from anything controversial or political, and they did the opposite. And I think it's actually paid off for them. They've been even more embraced and have gained in fan base. You're seeing that with, I think, artists like Taylor Swift out here that are taking more political stances. Whether it's K-pop or whether it's just artists in general, what are you seeing in terms of, when we talk about, empowering our young people, young Korean Americans, empowering our communities, what can young people do, aside from following BTS and, reserving a ticket and not showing up at a rally? What are some other things, practical things they can do? I know John, you mentioned registering to vote. That's automatic, but sometimes they don't do that. Vote.gov, right?
Yeah, so I think that incident has at least taught me that if you have fame and you can leverage the fame and the popularity to mobilize, it can be done, especially with the technology we have today. And so going back to registering to vote and get the vote out, why not use it? Why not leverage that? And to the extent that you can. I was really, really impressed with how they were able to mobilize so quickly. And that gave me tremendous optimism for KAPA and for Korean Americans at large. Hey, look, if we can leverage people with influence, like Paul and Angela, and get the word out, use the technology, and pull people together. The 2010 census had us about 1.8 million Korean Americans in the country. We don't know the figure as of today, and we'll know in due time. Most Korean Americans believe that we have 2.5 million Korean Americans. Okay, I don't know why. There's no empirical data for that. But just for the sake of arguing, let's assume 2 million people. And if we can leverage the influence and couple that with technology to mobilize in the way they did, just imagine if we can get 100,000 Korean Americans together to act together in aggregation, putting together the resource to elevate our voice. Enormously powerful. And really that's what I think KAPA is trying to do, and that's our goal. And just 100,000 is only 5% of the 2 million people, by the way. So if we can get 20%, that's 400,000 people. So, just do the math, and I think the potential is there.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing about, in addition to registering to vote and all the other things, I think the most tangible thing that I've seen happen is the number of Koreans, both young and old, who participated in protests over the last several months, both here in Los Angeles, but down in Irvine. I was really very proud to see so many Korean Americans that really took the time to make signs and stand on corners for Black Lives Matter and I can't breathe, and because that was such an affront, not just to the African American community, but just to humanity. And I think it unleashed something in so many different groups in a way. And so I think that's the most immediate thing that I think people can do. And I've seen more and more young people do that. And then, you know, Roy, you were a big supporter of Andrew Yang, and I was Bernie. There were a lot of young people and Asian Americans supporting both candidates as well. And quite a few Korean Americans. I was involved in the Korean Americans for Bernie group. Incredible, passionate people. And I'm really, really encouraged by that. And one of the things I think since we're talking a little bit about political power, is I think there is an effort to divide our communities coming up, which is the Prop 16, which is to restore affirmative action in the state of California. And it can be used for everything from university admissions to others. And people are trying to divide the Asian American community against the Latino community, against the African American community, when collectively, I think we should be coming together to demand more, a bigger pie, not to fight over the measly crumbs of the pie. So these are the types of things that I think the George Floyd issue, the Breonna Taylor's, have really, really united so many different groups across multiple lines. And I saw people in their late 60s, early 70s, Korean women, giving impassioned speeches at the rally in Koreatown Plaza during this, during the protest. So, you know, I think organizing and all the things that John is doing on a much more sophisticated level are so important. But also just to see more and more Korean Americans rolling up their sleeves, writing a poster and going down to a rally is pretty cool to see that too.
Yeah, you know.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Sorry, Roy. So Paul, you were involved with the initially the Korean American Foundation that I was trying to launch. It did get launched, and the foundation, which is based in LA, has decided to give money to the food bank and Kiwa in light of what's happening today. So Korean American philanthropy is now extending beyond our own community, right? Because, like you said, it has come to a point where many of us are looking at this as a humanitarian issue for all of us.
I think that's that, you know, I'm glad you brought that up. We and it's almost like it comes full circle. It's almost feeding on each other when you're seeing, you know, maybe more traditional Korean organizations, and you know, they're witnessing young people, young Korean Americans, young Asian Americans who are out protesting. I think first of all, being out there is so important for other communities to see that we support them. And I think it's important for that to appear in media too. You know, if you're a young Asian American teen and you're seeing someone that looks like you in support of Black Lives Matter or any other causes that are, you know, attacking racial injustice or any injustice, I think it encourages them to get involved. So I think, yeah, absolutely, you know, power of media, you know, for us to be able to tell our own story, and you know, for us to choose how we want to be represented. I'll go to Angela. You know, I mentioned earlier, you know, CGA was the company behind the success of Parasite. You know, obviously not just a huge hit in Korea, but just an amazing film. And that night watching the Oscars, you know, I was a film major. You know, grew up not a fan and a student of film, and it was a brilliant film. But just to watch all the awards being collected that night, you know, just you know, I was in tears. But tell us about the process behind it.
Yeah, so I mean, we saw the film. Obviously, my colleagues in Korea had seen it really early on, but you know, we got a chance to see it in May at Cannes. and the audience response was amazing. And the minute we saw it, and just personally, and a goal for CJ has been for the last 10 years that I've been here, win an Oscar for Korea, because a Korean, despite the fame and renown of Korean film and filmmakers.
You mean win a collection of Oscars, right?
No, but a Korean film or filmmaker had never even received a single nomination. So we had a low bar to clear, and I was like, okay, this is it. We're gonna go, and we were all strategizing, like, this is the year we're gonna get serious about this to really make it happen. But it was the universality of the message and the opportunity that it afforded to really engage. And the irony is, it's all in Korean language. It's very specific, and yet that allowed everybody an entree into it, because everybody I met who I talked to about the film, which I felt like I did for about 8 months straight, talked about like, oh, I really got it. Like, I really felt like it was my story, and which was an amazing testament to Director Bong. But the other part of it was that, because Korea's never been involved in an Oscar campaign, so I'd never seen it, from the inside before. It's exactly like retail politics. It's shaking hands, meeting people, being a face, a real person, not this other, and having a couple of additional barriers to overcome. Language barrier, being an outsider, did you put in your dues? All the normal things that come into, are you acceptable to come into the circle? It's not, the film is phenomenal. Of course, that's the baseline. And maybe this is how we feel. I mean, this is what makes us model minority pressure, right? Like, okay, just being good is the baseline, and you have to do everything above that. But that's what, Director Bong was, I've never seen anybody work harder, but his translator, everybody else, we were out there every single day, because it wasn't about how many ads you could put in. Every other studio, I think the number around Netflix is that well, I don't know the actual number, tens of millions of dollars. We were not working with that kind of budget, but it was about meeting people, hearts and minds. So it actually gave me a lot of hope for the political side. Mm-hmm. If you go out and do the work of meeting with people and having that connection, language, culture, all those chasms can be broke, because people do understand and are willing to make that connection.
Yeah, it's a lesson in a great film isn't just going to do it by itself. Same as a great candidate isn't going to do it, by him or herself, right? You've got to put the work in. You've got to support. You need people to rally and offer support. I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions submitted by viewers. Yes, submitted by viewers. The first question comes from Caroline Sim, who's a senior director at Metro. When you were younger, what was one profession you thought you couldn't succeed in because you were Asian? How is it different now? And of course, I'm asking, a Korean parent's dream, a doctor and a lawyer. So, what was one profession you thought you couldn't succeed in because you were Asian?
Go ahead, John.
Okay. I actually wanted to become a professional musician and wanted to pursue acting. I took acting classes for one semester in high school, and I did miserably. And I at the time, there were no Asian movie stars who were role models for us. The only Asian male actor who wasn't a waiter or laundromat owner, it was Bruce Lee. And so I just never imagined that an Asian American in this country could actually be a star in Hollywood or in the movies. But Parasite and all the movies that preceded Parasite proved me wrong, and I'm so glad that I was wrong.
So my parents were atypical in that they didn't really want me to be a doctor. Actually, when I called my mom to tell her I got into medical school, she was somewhat disappointed because I think she and my dad really wanted me to become a pastor, which wasn't going to happen. But I would say that if I was in college and they had these opportunities to go do internships on the Hill, I definitely would have really wanted to look into that. That was just not something that was available. There really wasn't anyone that looked like us in Congress at the time. Well, in a way it was there, but and maybe Norm Mineta, but really it was very, very few, and it's just not something you would ever think of doing back then. So that probably would, I'm not to say I would have gone into politics, but I would have liked to have had that opportunity, and who knows, maybe become a staffer or something along those lines. So.
Well, I've seen you on CNN and other news shows. It's not too late, Paul. I know Lisa's going to hate me for saying that, but not too late.
Yeah. Well, again, we'll see. Certainly, I had thought about it 2 years ago, and unfortunately, Lisa's father got ill at the time, and it just would have been too much of a strain on us, and also, and you know this, Roy, as a father of two young kids, that's really the number one priority for me. One thing I know from my grandfather, who was in politics, was he was not there for his younger kids growing up, and you could see the long-term effects on that. And I think the number one priority right now for me is to just raise the healthiest, normal kids as possible.
Yeah. How about you, Angela?
It's less about, I'm mixed, my dad's Irish American and my mom's Korean, but I grew up in Korea. But it's less about that, but more about my circumstances. I don't think I was ever limited or not limited in what I thought I could do, because my parents had, overcome and just ignored all kinds of social barriers to do whatever the hell they damn well pleased. For me, I think it was growing up in Korea and really feeling, and even from a young age, introducing Korea to a lot of people. My mom had a PR business, so she always had foreign clients, and I was translating and giving people tours and stuff like that. But Korean people never thought I was Korean. So it's kind of like, it's almost like my career got defined by, well, I'll show them like I'm the non-Korean potentially person who, between NetKAL and, CJ and movies and K-pop, my entire career has been about promoting Korean-ness, but not in a one way. I mean, it's really about promoting understanding, and being proud of who we are. This is what we have and what we are, and I want to share that with you. And it goes both ways, and it's just all to the good. So yeah, I always say that, previously when I was at USC, that was my dream job. Now I'm at CJ, this is my dream job. I'm just very lucky to do what I do.
Yeah.
And I just want to say to Angela that I think my liver's Irish. So
I know. It's a good combination.
Well,
we are the Irish of the East, right?
Yeah,
right.
We take pride in that. I love when Angela just speaks out in perfect fluent Korean, and then you just see the people that didn't know just kind of, whoa, step back.
You were asking about multicultural in Korea. That happens less and less. People are not surprised because there's so many, which is a really good sign.
Oh yeah. Nowadays it doesn't, but I remember some of the early trips to, I think the first trip to Korea, and I kind of observed people when you start speaking in perfect Korean. Yeah, you're right. Nowadays, a lot of non-Koreans speak better Korean than.
Now they're like, what's wrong with you? You don't know that? So, the bar keeps getting higher.
Yeah. I have one more question, and then I'm going to close it out with, it's kind of a related question. So maybe what I'll do is I'll ask this. This one is from Joyce Kang, who is a student at Harvard. What advice would you give to the Korean American college student who is looking to get involved and make a difference? So, probably some similar advice from earlier. And then you can either choose or you can combine it into one answer, but a a common experience of Korean Americans, at least that grew up in the U.S. with immigrant parents, was the push by our parents to assimilate. They want us to speak perfect English, maybe even at the cost of forgetting our Korean. As parents to Korean American children, what have you or what will you arm your children with as they go out into the world? And I'll let anyone start.
Well, can I start that? Because
Sure.
I have my dream job. My dream job came from no plan whatsoever. Was a parasite. Best plan is no plan.
Yeah.
But it really has always been about similar skill set. So it was never about the profession. It was about what I like to do. And what I like to do is maybe see a goal or understand trends and figure out how to put it together so we can get there. I mean, in the film industry, it's like a producer does that, or community organization, you have goals, but you don't have a lot of money. So how are you going to figure that out? KCON was a little bit like that. We wanted to get K-pop out there, but again, we didn't have money, we didn't have stars, but we wanted to bring the people together. So there's always the problem solving, solution finding was always my great interest. I love crossword puzzles. And so just going off of that and following that seems to have been fine. I mean, maybe it sounds very irresponsible to recommend somebody to do that, but whatever you have an interest in, that's probably the right answer to start with. And in terms of, what I'm doing, I have an 11-year-old son, what I'm doing for him and his Koreanness. So I am simultaneously extremely vigilant about his cultural background and so negligent, like I should be shot. So my husband is Chinese American. And so I go, okay, he's half Chinese, quarter Korean, quarter whatever else. And, we live near Chinatown. And I took Chinese in college. So I was like, let's send him to a Chinese immersion school, because my experience was growing up speaking Korean, learning Chinese in college was not that hard. So I've been vigilant about putting him in a completely Chinese environment so that he at least speaks it. And thank God I did, because he is so resistant to speaking it that if I hadn't done it, he would not know 2 words of Chinese. That said, does he know any Korean? No. So I'm terrible Korean parent. I'm just hoping that the Asian part sticks and then we build from there. It's a long-term plan.
John or Paul?
I'll do the easy one first. So I don't have any young children. All of my kids are in their 30s. They're all married. So at this point, it's about how I could influence my grandchildren, and I have 2 of them. So I am, luckily for us, the Koreanness and Korean culture, Korean language has become so popular at the global level that it doesn't take much arm twisting to get them interested in Korean culture and Korean language. In fact, my daughters are insisting that I teach, or my wife teaches, the Korean language to our grandkids. So that's a good thing. In terms of the experience, going back to the question from the student at Harvard, I think the fact that he asked that question, he or she asked the question, means that the person is more than halfway there. It's wonderful to hear that kind of question from young people. And in terms of, I think everything Angela said, I agree. I don't need to add to that, but more on the practical level, what I would suggest is what Paul had mentioned earlier about internship. I think that's just a fabulous way to get your feet wet and get exposure and really understand the issues. Just being a little bit partial on this, I would suggest that he consider applying for an internship at Kappa and be involved. And we just have a ton of work that we need to get done, and everyone's unpaid. So if the person's willing to volunteer his or her time, we're all ears. Thank you.
Well, John, let me ask you real quick then. You have, some kids that are in their 30s. How different is it letting them go out in the world when they were kids? And do you feel the same with your grandkids? Are the concerns the same? Or is the level of concern the same?
I think so. You would think that the racism and the hatred and the bigotry and all the evil and crazy things that are happening in this country nowadays would have, died down quite a bit, and we would see a different world. But I grew up in the 60s in the U.S. I came from Seoul in 1967, grew up here since then, and yes, that was literally a year before ML King was assassinated, and 2 years after the Voting Rights Act got passed. So you can imagine, even for Californians, it was racism was everywhere, and we lived through that. Okay, and yes, I think there's much less so in California, but still, what you see on the news is just horrifying, and you realize that we still have a long journey, and the battle is ongoing. So I think it's unfortunately not much progress has been made, although progress has been made, and I think we need to work harder. And so that's why I am so devoted to working for civil rights and racial justice and social justice.
Paul?
So I'm going to take the first question, and I'm going to actually play moderator and let you take the second question. Okay. First, I will just say to anybody who is in college and trying to figure out what they want to do next, obviously it's a different situation right now with the pandemic and what's happening with the economy. So I think it's an absolute great time to pursue something that maybe you wouldn't have pursued had the world just been in its normal frenetic pace, right? So I think, barring if you have to go back and immediately start to earn something to support your family or pay off student loans right away, I think what I would say is take your time to try to figure out what it is you really want to do, that you're passionate about, because I think so often people go into something because that's what they think they have to do, and then 20 years later they realize they're miserable, and they're kind of just miserable, right? So, and then you also have people that I know that their whole 20s they didn't really know what they wanted to do, and I said, you shouldn't put so much pressure on you, because even if you've decided what it is you wanted to do when you were late 30s, early 40s, you still have to do that for the next 20 years of your life. So they have the advantage of time and also the ability. There's so many more things that they can try to do, whether it be an internship, whether it be, but I would really encourage people not to lose sight of some dreams that they have. And that's the one thing I think that we as Korean kids in the 70s, we were not told to pursue our dreams. We were told, go get a good job and, get into an Ivy League school and do all those things. So the viewer that asked the question, he's already in a good school, so now just follow your dreams is what I would tell him. With regard to raising Korean kids, I'm with Angela. I've got a Chinese wife and our kids are learning Mandarin. So that's why I want to now turn the tables and play moderator, Roy. You've got two beautiful boys. What is it and how are you raising your kids to really honor their Korean traditions and such?
Yeah, just like you, growing up in the 70s and 80s, my dad was very old fashioned. He was old school, really pushed about grades, and it wasn't so much about the learning, right? And with my kids, they have, the same thing that you're offering your girls is, follow your dream, like follow your passion, all the things that, where the world is opening up to them. There's two things, with my kids going out there in the world, as Korean Americans, we're trying our best to speak in Korean to them so that they, you know, try to retain some of it. So, you know, it's cute. They go through they're taking Korean lessons and they try to speak to each other in Korean, and it's, you know, my wife and I just crack up, but we love the effort. And just as two young boys going out in the world, I think going back to, you know, the opportunities that they have now, you know, the ability to learn. I mean, we're in a pandemic, and, you know, my wife is principal of our schoolhouse. You know, they're still, you know, taking classes all day, online classes, learning, reading. And, but what comes with that though is almost a perfectionist attitude that my older son has. And that when he fails, he takes it extremely hard and almost shuts down. And so, you know, what I want him to learn is, you know, grit and picking yourself up, and that it's not going to go according to plan, right? Right, Angela, right? Best plan is having no plan. You know, that's especially since, you know, what we've been learning the last 5 months is things are always going to change. Like now we know that nothing is set. Whatever we think is going to happen is likely not going to happen. So just, you know, adaptability and grit is what I hope they enter the world with. Okay, well, it's getting late. You know, if you watched this from the beginning to the end, you saw the light change, the lighting change in each of our locations. You know, I want to thank our speakers. Thank you guys for your insight and guidance. I really enjoyed speaking to you tonight. Special thanks, of course, to NetKAL and the Korea Foundation for organizing tonight's event and inviting us to speak. And of course, thank you to all the viewers. We really appreciate your time and attention and watching tonight. Please stay safe out there. Thank you.